Robin.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking if we have, is Antonio with us? Not. I'll take it off. All right. Well, dear guests, once again, welcome. It is a pleasure to welcome you, especially those of you who are able to join us here in person, and for everyone that is tuning in virtually. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to the 4th edition of the World Arbitration Update, and especially so as it is the first one that encompasses Central and Eastern Europe. Before us, we have a remarkable panel of esteemed practitioners that will discuss the topic of the global trend, the effects of global trends and geopolitics on the energy disputes in the region. Just briefly on the World Arbitration Update, for those of you that might not be as familiar with the concept. The conference was initiated 4 years ago with 2 main goals. The first one was to provide annual updates on the topics of international arbitration and public international law. And the second one, to decentralize the practice of international arbitration beyond traditional arbitration centers. Because of the latter, I'm really grateful to Jose Antonio and to Maria Lucia, especially for providing me and all of us the platform to bring the conference to Warsaw. And hopefully this is just the first one out of many to come. None of this would be possible without the generous support of our host, PwC. So thank you very much, and also for treating us to delicious lunch. Thank you to our sponsors, Kubas Gałkowski, Patricia's Home, and to Baker Hostetler for your generous support in helping us bring the conference to the beautiful city of Warsaw. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Patricia to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Jadranka, for your kind introduction. It's a privilege to welcome you as a moderator of the 3rd panel today during the World Arbitration Update. It's the 3rd and the last panel today, but it's the first panel after the lunch break. But good for organizers that during the lunch I didn't hear any discussion or jokes about the food. You know, some people in Woody Allen's movie probably didn't know the joke when 2 women having dinner, and one of them says to the other, "The food here is terrible," and the other says, "Yes, I know, and the portion also small." It's not about our panel at all, because our discussion will be tasty, and you will receive solid, valuable portions of both energy and arbitration topics. And the topic of our panel is the effects of geopolitics and global trends on the energy dispute in Central and Eastern Europe. Let's start by getting an understanding of this landscape. We are in the middle of European energy transformation driven by net zero goals. The goal for countries is to limit increasing global temperature to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. To do so, we have to reduce the amount of emissions by 45% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. Cutting carbon emissions can be achieved by using renewable energy sources such as wind, sunlight, also water. Poland's energy mix is still based on coal. The share of coal in electricity production in Poland was almost 70% in last year, 23, the renewable energy sources, mainly wind and solar, gave us about 20% last year, and the share of gas was about 8%, and energy from water about 2%. We still don't have a nuclear power plant, but today Poland is facing the challenge of building our first one. As can we see, there is plenty of room for improvement, probably not only in Poland. On the other hand, we live in a world which is still changing. The political situation, war and pandemic and energy crisis caused inter alia by sanctions on Russian gas forced EU countries to review their energy policies, energy strategies. And where there are big challenges and quite narrow time frameworks, there is a higher risk too. We will talk today together with our panelists during the next 1.5 hours about the challenges, the risks, including dispute risk, and the proposal for their solutions. Let me briefly introduce the panelists, and you can find more detailed bios on the conference website. Jana Lefrem is a principal in HKA. HKA is leading global consultancy in risk mitigation, dispute resolution, expert witness, and litigation support. Jana is a chartered financial analyst, charter holder with more than 15 years of professional experience. She has led teams supporting the named expert on more than 30 occasions. Marcin Kołduński is professor of international law at the Nicholas Copernicus University in Toruń, Poland, and counsel at the General Counsel to the Republic of Poland, and vice director of the International and European Law Unit. He specialized in international and investor state disputes. Marcin has represented the Republic of Poland as lead or co-lead counsel in a number of investment arbitration brought against the Republic of Poland for foreign investors under both bilateral investment treaties and the Energy Charter Treaty. Maciej Bukowski is a climate diplomacy and energy security expert and a PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science and International Relations at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He has published and spoken extensively on the geopolitics of climate change, a former international disputes lawyer and a graduate of Cornell and Sorbonne Law Schools. He was a chief expert for the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment, and currently a senior international analyst expert for the Polish Development Bank, BGK. Bartosz Tchórzewski is a partner in Clifford Chance. His practice focused on a wide range of arbitration and litigation matters. He specialized in complex disputes, both domestic and international. He has represented states, governmental agencies, and private parties. He regularly sits as an arbitrator under various arbitration rules and published in the field of arbitration. And Mark Cantor currently serves as an arbitrator in international investment and commercial disputes. Previously, he was a partner in international law firm. Mark teaches courses in both international arbitration and international business transaction as an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. He was an arbitrator in over 50 commercial and investment arbitration. And now we can start our panel, and we start our panel with
just briefly, apologies before we do that. Please, last but not least, Patricia, our wonderful moderator. And so just briefly a few words about you. Patricia is an advocate, partner, and co-leader of energy and natural resources practice at KKG law firm, which is one of the sponsors, as I had mentioned before. Patricia has over 15 years experience in litigation and almost 10 years experience in services for the energy market. She provides comprehensive legal services to all entities involved in the energy transition, assisting them in all aspects of their operations. Back to you.
Nice to be here and nice to having my panelists here. We start our panel with the presentation given by Maciej. Without further ado, Maciej, the floor is yours.
Wonderful, thank you very much. It really is a privilege, not least because of the wonderful panelists that I'm sharing the stage with today. It's quite something for me. having worked in arbitration for a couple of years and having transitioned to the policy sphere, and having changed the hats, like a friend put it one day, that I was a fixer. I'm trying to fixing things in arbitration and now try to mess them up in the policy sphere, because as you know all too well, oftentimes things go south in arbitration when governments implement bad policies. But with regard to this presentation today and the topic, I felt like maybe the added value of my presentation could actually lie in not giving you the legal nitty-gritty that you are all too knowledgeable about, but perhaps to give you a sort of a perspective that could be valuable in terms of how geopolitics have came up and shaped the energy landscape in the region and in Europe in the last couple of years, and what this means for the distribution industry. And broadly speaking, I would risk saying that these developments, they can be traced down to a number of elements, the most important of which I would say are these. 5 phenomena, 5 factors, if you like. Above all, energy security, the holy grail of energy policy in the region and in Europe more broadly lately. And this has not always been the case. 3 years ago, you could tell that many governments in Europe would be more concerned about the energy in the grid being clean than about having steady supplies. Now it's exactly the other way around. What counts most for governments these days is to have a steady supply of energy, regardless, or rather, it's a secondary consideration of whether that supply is clean or not. So above all, for the handboard, what matters is for the energy to be there. And this has resulted in a bunch of developments such as bigger imports of hydrocarbons for power plant places, but also bigger extraction and consumption domestically in the countries in the region where this is possible, including Poland. Now, the energy security requirement is related to another strive for energy independence, which is a broader notion. It sort of encompasses energy security, but the difference relies in the fact that states are now increasingly concerned about not only having enough supplies, but also making sure that, to the extent possible, these supplies are diversified. So, for instance, think about Germany, that has all too long relied on imports from Russia. This has changed swiftly from basically just like that 2 years ago. And what has happened since is that for a country that did not have a single energy receiving infrastructure, and they have 3 in about 2 years, only to import LNG from Qatar and other places at a time when the EU taxonomy sees the natural gas as a transitory fuel, meaning the one that only 20 years from now will basically not cool anymore under EU policy guidelines. So a lot of investments of both money and energy in terms of how policymakers see it, into making sure that energy is secured. But then it's not only about importing energy from abroad, it's also about increasing our own domestic capacities to produce it. So the consequence of that is that we have been witnessing the greatest proliferation of renewable energy in the region ever. And that track will continue. And the yet another side effect of that is that nuclear energy, as you all know, is witnessing a renaissance of sorts. Coming back to Europe for a big pump. We have projects now in Poland, like you said. We've been trying to set up 1 plant for the past 20 years with little success thus far, but we have projects in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Ukraine, you name it. And all of this is related to yet another phenomenon, the one that encompasses all and is like this over-aiming theme, that is decarbonization. Because even if we are now seeing that energy security and independence is so much more important for states and policymakers, at the very same time, that goal to go green is not foreshadowed entirely. It's more like a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of situation configuration, whereas supply is first, but then gradually states are implementing more and more policies in order to make the grid green. And what this means exactly? Well, we've seen a lot of policy changes, a lot of new initiatives to taking shape, both in the legal and political sense of the term. In the later, that's maybe some relevance in here, could be, for instance, one of the main examples would be, for instance, the Free Seas Initiative, a format that is aimed to bring together the 18 governments from the region between the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea to work together in order to establish a common framework for closing the gap, the investment gap in infrastructure in the region, which is like estimated to be over $1 trillion. Just one of them examples. European integration, more outpouring of EU regulations in the industry than ever. And some of them very controversial. I mean, think about it this way. 3 years ago, who would have thought that the EU would ever step up the game and, for instance, come up with proposal like the Repower EU, basically a robust regime that introduces not only sanctions, but also taps into directly sovereign state prerogatives in the fields of energy. Fairly controversial, not anymore because the geopolitical game has changed considerably. Trade dynamics, certainly a lot of changes here, especially for renewables, because we need all these new supply chains for critical minerals from Africa, from Asia, you name it, in order for the green transition, so that energy independence quest to be satisfied. And then the impact of sanctions, of course, as a more overaiming and a broader theme is something that is that shadow lurking in behind that is complicating things and the fields for practitioners even more. And what this all means for the disputes industry specifically? Well, one way to look at it, it is not exactly a legal perspective, but I think at the end of the day, it's the law that follows politics. So I'll share that insight anyways, is that if you look at the past, historically, every single energy transition that ever happened, whether it will be from charcoal to coal in this 18th century, whether it would be when the steam engine really took off in the 19th century, or whether it would be with oil that showed up in the 19th century and really took off in the 20th, every single of these transitions, and this one is no different, resulted in a redistribution of power in the geopolitical terms. And it's no different now, because we have supply chains that are disappearing, gradually but progressively, but new ones that are appearing and gaining relevance, especially for critical minerals. But the difference, a major difference in here, is that that power that in the past basically was asserting itself, especially in, say, 2D flat dimensional spaces, whereas we would have boundaries and jurisdictions that begin here and they end there, and so on and so forth. Now we are increasingly witnessing what one English scholar, Stuart Delby, said, called volumetric geopolitics, meaning that we're increasingly seeing that power, in political terms, is being asserted in these 3D spaces, in air, in water, and also in space. Take, for instance, how controversial was the South-China arbitration, and how difficult it is actually to change the reality, whereas you have the law on one hand and what the tribunal decided, and then you have the matter of politics and actual force that does not allow for that decision to be implemented at a time when China's government has the upper hand, both militarily and politically. Or the other example would be, for instance, the carbon emissions, and all these entities that have shaped the emissions trading regime. Those who are designing these rules are necessarily getting more sway in the game, right? So I'm telling you all this because in the broader sense of the term, we are now witnessing a sort of a new, large, complex governance regime that is then being implemented through law. And these laws and regulations will necessarily continue to evolve, to be adapted and adjusted accordingly as the geopolitical landscape evolves. And one very specific illustration of this phenomenon, to quote one of many, would be the emergence of the hydrogen economy, which I have chosen as a very specific illustration to give you a glimpse into what possibly the future holds for us. Well, I assume some of you, if not all of you, must have already at least heard about the hydrogen bubble and how hydrogen is about to revolutionize the world of energy. Well, why the hype? Well, it's abundant. It's one of the most common elements, chemically speaking, on Earth. It's clean, at least in its essence, as such, not necessarily in the process of obtaining it, because the hype is about green hydrogen, meaning the one that is produced in the electrochemical process from water, when you split water into oxygen and hydrogen, and then it is clean as such. So it taps into all these legal requirements of the EU concerning green production. The entire framework is now being developed around that. thus far, however, what we've been seeing is that the hydrogen has proven itself useful in the development, in fueling different industries, but through gray hydrogen, which is one that is produced from natural gas, a different process. So the hype now is not about the gray one, but about the green one. And why so? It's because, among other things, it has very impressive energy yields. Basically, for the same unit of hydrogen and, say, coal or other fossil fuels, you have 3 times bigger the energy output. So that's very impressive, and this is something that a lot of these policy measures are being based on. It's stored very easily. It's quite flexible. It's versatile in terms of it being possibly adapted, could be adapted in across various sectors, from transportation to heavy industries and so on and so forth. And it, most importantly, perhaps, it could be produced during off-peak hours. So basically, especially those of you who have dealt with renewables, you all well to know and must have had probably many of your clients that the nightmare of renewables still today is the fact that we are wasting a lot of energy because we cannot yet store it efficiently. Possibly for hydrogen, this could be different, precisely because as a gas, it can be stored much more easily than electricity. The running joke of sorts is that as of today, as the technology stands, it's more efficient and cheaper actually to store hydrogen than electricity, but it's more expensive to move it than to do the same with electricity, precisely because we've already established transmission lines and so on for decades. And this is new. Why is this troubling? It's because there we have a lot of pipelines pushing natural gas, which we would like to use for pushing hydrogen in the future. Technically speaking, this is very difficult because hydrogen has a lesser density, so it's much more difficult to push it through the pipelines. Nonetheless, it is happening. And why so? Well, not only because of the technological advancements happening in terms of its production and the hydrogen valleys, which are the dedicated economic zones in Europe, about 80 of them already in the EU, 11 in Poland alone that are meant to advance these technologies, and not because only it holds much premise in terms of advancing decarbonization, but perhaps because of one single item that is meant, at least in Europe, to cover up for this gap in terms of investments, needs, and trade shifts. This is from Star Wars. Sorry. No worries. It's for the CE at least, and I'll try to stop at that because we're already running out of time, is that the single most important item, perhaps, in our region that may indeed be the game changer for hydrogen to actually really take off, because at the very end of the day, it's no advanced physics, it's just simple math, economics, demand supply. There needs to be demand for the cost to go down. So what is happening actually now, you perhaps may not yet have heard about it, but you probably should, which is why I'm telling you this, is this. The hydrogen corridors, arguably, in my view, the most consequential, most important infrastructure endeavor in Europe in decades. Essentially in 2020, the German government, or even before the war started and even before COVID, they decided that eventually they should switch from natural gas to hydrogen. Fast forward 4 years, we have now a robust regulatory framework that is aimed at basically pushing these 31 companies to establish a network of different pipeline corridors that not only will be moving green hydrogen produced from different parts of Europe, but also from all these far-flung exotic places that either the EU or the Germany itself has already signed off agreements with to secure future supplies. These countries are, and I think investment arbitration made some points being the game here, Morocco, Chile, Argentina, Oman, Australia, the US, Norway, and so on and so forth, a lot of countries. So it's no pipe dream, these pipelines are happening. Whether hydrogen is about really to be more of a gloom, no doom, we'll see. But in terms of the overall investments that needs to be in place for that to take off, it is happening. And this certainly for disputes may indeed mean quite a bit, because this entire environment requires, as you can imagine, multiple stakeholders. Project dynamics are very deep and broad. High market expectations that we are witnessing today. There is an international nature of the hydrogen economy, like we mentioned, and then obviously disputes could arise from all sorts of things, from technology transfer, IP rights, the establishment of international standards, and so on and so forth. So certainly something that the community should look into. And I think I'll stop it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Maciej, for your fascinating presentation. And maybe the others will see the opportunity to refer to your presentation during their speeches. And now we can begin the discussion. And our discussion will take place on 3 acts, we can say. And the first one about state investment disputes, and the second about energy infrastructure and disputes regarding the energy infrastructure, and the last one will be about the rise of arbitration and energy disputes. My first question goes to Marcin, and it will be about state investment dispute. Marcin, could you please give us some inside views and a review of trends on state investment disputes in the energy sector? Are there any specific disputes related to the race to green energy and net zero? And how can you define the role of state-owned enterprises in energy sector in investor-state disputes?
Thank you much, Patricia. Thank you much. I hope I'm audible. Thank you much, Patricia. Thank you much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here with such a distinguished panelists. And let's get to the chase. And well, I shall perhaps start with some introductory remarks because we have also other panelists who would like to deal with the issues you mentioned. I'll start with just a very basic, remark that focus on some sort of certainty that any change, either in regulatory and scientific landscape, as well as just geopolitical factors, triggers an increase in the number of disputes in the infrastructure and energy sectors. And of course, this also triggers the change in the role of the state-owned enterprises, which usually, but not always, pursue the goals of the state. The past few years has seen a series of events causing massive economic disruption, and these events have great potential to impact infrastructure and energy projects, including, for example, suspension of works, increased cost of material, trade barriers, and disrupted supply chains. And in our region, in Central and Eastern Europe, national infrastructure and energy projects are capable of being constructed using internal and external resources. That, of course, will depend on foreign investment to deliver its ambitious projects. However, the region is more susceptible now to geopolitical risks caused by the war in Ukraine. And this decreases, in my opinion, and as I see this in practice, incentives for foreign investors to invest in the region. And in particular, the global mining and commodities markets are being adversely affected by events such as the Russia-Ukraine war. The pressure faced by these industries is likely to grow, especially as a result of increasing demands to accelerate the energy transition and changing regulatory landscape targeting supply chains. And this, in turn, turning to your questions, does bring me to my point. It is a rise in investor-state treaty arbitration, especially when foreign investors have been impacted by macro-governmental policy decisions such as sanctions, or a change in the regulatory landscape caused by for example, climate protection. And for example, in Central and Eastern European governments may be planning to review mineral rights related barriers to exploration, extraction, and seek ways to expedite, or to limit critical mineral mine development for external partners. For example, there are changes in domestic mining laws imposing restrictions on investment by foreign state-owned companies in its critical mineral sectors. And any change related to the permitting of mining developments may lead to an increase in ISDS disputes. And this brings me to the trends non-state investment disputes in the energy sector. And I can, at least for the sake of this panel, identify 3 basic and perhaps contradictory trends. The first, as a point which could somehow contradict what I just said, is the declining use of ISDS as it comes from the statistics published by manifold sites, for example, and of course the intergovernmental bodies such as the AXI. For example, in 2022, 56 new cases were publicly filed, although the number is slightly higher, or as some treaty arbitration are confidential. And this was a reduction in the number of overall cases from 2021, and the lowest annual number of known cases is 2010. But we see another trend. It is the new BITs being signed by many countries, such as, for example, China, Latin American countries, or even African states. Even Venezuela has switched from being reluctant to sign new BITs by returning to the new model, so to say, BITs, which actually is much more restrictive to investors and reflect a modernization of BITs. So anyway, there is a new trend of, we might say, a reversing trend of signing new BITs, which of course includes certain dispute settlement clauses. And the third trend I have identified for the sake of this presentation is that there has been an increasing trend of climate-related cases over the past few years. There is a growing body of investment treaty case law concerning state measures, in particular, related to climate change and decarbonization. Regulatory incentive schemes linked to solar power have led to a significant number of claims against Spain, Italy, and the Czech Republic. New categories of claim have also arisen regarding the decision to phase out certain energy sources, such, for example, as the Uniper LWE cases against the Netherlands or Westmoreland against Canada, and about state decision to deny approvals for projects on climate change grants, such as TransCanada versus US or Rockhopper versus Italy. And during the latter half of 2023, two arbitrations were commented by CEF against Australia, and there's a prospect of a third. And all these arbitrations are based on the rejection of coal mining licenses on climate change grants. And against this background, my point is that climate-related ISDS disputes are likely to increase as the need to curb greenhouse gas emission, for example, switch into the hydrogen industry, as was indicated by my colleague, becomes more urgent, and countries look to align their government policies with the climate goals. So perhaps we can start with this, our discussion with the ISDS topic, and then pose three basic questions. First is, what challenges does investor-state arbitration face as a process for resolving climate challenge-related dispute? Is it that the arbitrators should be more open toward the scientific developments, or the switch of the public policy to protect environment? Second question might be, are there any specific disputes related to the race to green energy net zero? Perhaps you know any of these cases that might be discussed by this panel. And what could be the role of state-owned enterprises in such investor-state disputes, if any, of course, because state-owned enterprises are not parties to this investment arbitration. So that's my 3 points. I would think perhaps any of you, Mark, perhaps you would like to start, or Bartosz.
Yes, please, but we have a few minutes more, so take your time.
The topic that you raised covers the gamut of what everybody on this panel will talk about. You raised it particularly in the context of investor-state dispute resolution. I'd like to flip the board on you here and talk about the trends in the context of commercial arbitration. Not because investor-state is uninteresting, it fascinates all of us. But whenever we use the word investment, we always seem to append it to the ISDS system. And in fact, the vast majority of investment-related disputes arise in commercial arbitration. Shareholder disputes are an obvious example of that. Disputes arising out of successful or failed mergers and acquisitions are another example of that. So the points I'd like to make. First, I want to apologize. I'm going to tell you some numbers. Second, I'm going to offer some predictions. Third, I'm going to hope my friends on the my friends on the panel can then correct all of my predictions and tell me where I've got it wrong. Because as the very famous American philosopher and New York Yankees catcher, Yogi Berra once said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. Let me start with those boring numbers. Investment is going down and has been going down since at least 2018. Globally, investment dropped from a little over 3% of world GDP to roughly 1.3% of world GDP between 2018 and 2022. That's a 60% drop. Europe, in particular, has dropped again. The high point was 2017, but foreign direct investment in Europe dropped 11% below the level in 2019 and 14% below the level from 2017 in general. The impact of that is significant. It's particularly significant because of the distribution of the drop in investment. First and most significantly, in the time period, again, I'm using numbers that have shown up. They are not necessarily the same time periods, but they're helpful to give you an understanding of the trend. In 2020 through 2022, compared to 2015 and 2020, European investment in China for advanced European countries dropped 18% and dropped 31% for emerging European countries. We're seeing very significant drops for China, not for drops involving the US. So we have different allocations depending on the kind of country that we're dealing with. We also have differences within Europe. Overall, FDI in France has dropped. FDI in Germany has dropped. FDI in Southern and Eastern Europe, though, has grown particularly as a result of supply chain modifications arising out of both the pandemic and a reorientation away from China and reshoring of production activities internal into the country or the region. There are some areas where investment has increased. Tourism is an example of that, and culture. But tourism and culture, where you've had significant investment increases, is only a small portion of economic activity in Europe. So even though there have been large proportionate increases there, it doesn't have a huge impact on the total amount of deals, transactions. There are some countries that have seen significant increases, for example, in manufacturing, which overall has dropped in Europe by about 1%, has increased in Spain, Turkey, Poland, and Italy. Those numbers have consequences. This is the core point I want to make. As an oversimplification, transactions of the last 5 years produce disputes for the next 5 years, right? So what does that mean? Well, first, geopolitically, we're seeing creation of blocks that are built around China or blocks that are built around the US and its allies. So we will see an orientation of disputes involving those two blocks. Second, because of the overall drop-off in investment, which personally, I believe will continue for a number of years, we are seeing excuse me, a reduction in disputes involving manufacturing, and particularly a reduction in disputes involving software, IT, and business and professional services. That's where the largest drop-off has occurred. The intra-regional investments and internal within nation investments are not dropping off anywhere near the extent that global investments are dropping off. So we will see more intra-regional and intranational disputes arising from those investments. And we will see more disputes within the blocks that are emerging in our geopolitical world. And what does that mean for practicing lawyers in the arbitration field? Well, think about what that means for the substantive governing law. You're less likely to see disputes based on English law or New York law, and more likely to see disputes in which the substantive law is the law of the host state or its region. You're more likely to see the applicable arbitration law not being the English Arbitration Act 1996 or the Federal Arbitration Act or French arbitration law, but more likely to see regional or national arbitration laws because of the move towards regional transactions and national transactions. You're also going to see more of a movement towards the kind of process in arbitration that arises out of the culture that is found in those regions and in those nationalities, which I suggest means a little bit less of English or American style arbitration and a little bit more of civil law and Eastern and Southern European type arbitration process. So those are my predictions. Does anybody think that Yogi Bear is right and my predictions are really difficult? Those are my thoughts.
Well, maybe I can pick up on that point and bring sort of back the energy and European perspective. First of all, I thought maybe I could, even though Mark started on numbers, I will continue with some numbers because I actually work as a valuation expert in international arbitration. So apologies, I ask for your indulgence. We've already heard some of the cases that I will now mention that energy cases that we have seen in Europe. So the solar famous arbitration, Czech Republic was actually subject to 7 solar arbitrations. In Romania, just very recently, I think it was in March, there was a case decided and Romania was ordered to pay 46 million euros. In Bulgaria, again, a solar case, Bulgaria was ordered to pay 70 million euros in January 2024. Other cases that sort of flow with the decarbonization trend are the cases that actually Martin was mentioning, RWE in Germany, for example, the lignite power plants. There, actually, Germany subscribed to pay to RWE 2.6 billion euros. Interestingly, a very similar case run by RWE in the Netherlands was not successful, even though there is this plan to finish coal-fired production by 2030. Other type of cases that we have seen recently are related to natural gas. Gazprom, several large energy European players, including ČEZ, including Enel, including Bulgargas recently,
brought cases against Gazprom. Against these cases we're speaking of hundreds of millions of euros. So I think what was mentioned earlier, the trend, the green trend, and the focus on ESG matters. I think it is the sort of long-term trend, but it is disrupted by market changes. It has been disrupted by COVID. It has been disrupted by war in Ukraine. But let's hope, I think it's important to stick to this long-term goal. Mark, he mentioned the decrease in FDI. I will draw a parallel with energy in Europe. Actually, energy demand in Europe since 2008 decreased by 10%. It was basically hit by these exogenous crises, such as the financial crisis in 2008, by COVID, and recently by the energy crisis. But the forecast, at least according to Goldman Sachs report, is that the demand for energy will increase by 40% in the following 10 years. And that the drive behind the increase will be the data centers that are actually being opened in Europe, and the overall sort of pickup in electrification processes in industry, in transportation, so electric cars, but also in buildings management. So I think this means that energy. We are an energy-driven population, and I was joking when I was speaking to Mate that I can see that with my children. They wouldn't even go. They wouldn't walk for 5 minutes. They would take an electric scooter to do what normally we would have done, or at least my generation, we would walk. So I think we will. This is driving energy. Energy is a key and will remain the key for this economy, and we will continue to see dispute in this area.
Thank you, Iana. But state investment disputes is a big topic, and probably we could spend a lot of time on this. But I think that we should, move on. The next topic, we mentioned earlier a little about energy infrastructure disputes, and probably that investments in renewable energy projects continue to grow due to the fact that both countries and private sector should decarbonize their industry, and the investment in the energy sector are large, complex, and capital intensive. Some of them might use the new technology like CCS, like small modular reactors, and it's necessary to establish appropriate regulation which will support the new technologies on the way to decarbonization. And we can't forget about the grid too, because it's crucial, important to ensure that the grid is fit for the purpose of energy transformation. So the investments here would be probably too intensive too, and we could discuss about it a little. Do you agree how to de-risk clean tech investments, and what are the main factors of disputes in this area? Yeah, could you?
Well, I think I can probably speak more from the valuation perspective, and maybe Mate might have a view there. So if I look at sort of valuing companies and damages in both investment and in commercial arbitrations, there is this term used, stranded assets. So the changes in regulation, but also in market, can lead a company and asset to foreclose basically the possibility to generate future cash flows compared to sort of original plans. And this is obviously an issue for the investor because these are capex heavy investments, and they need time. Time is required to repay the initial investment and to actually earn a revenue, some kind of profit for the investor. So the regulatory changes in this area basically put a question mark over the amount of future cash flows, the timing of these future cash flows, the certainty of these cash flows, and therefore the discount rate that is being used to calculate the net present value of these cash flows. So to give a practical example, the hurdle rate for oil offshore projects is currently at around 25%, whereas for renewables, it's around 5%. What I mean by the hurdle rate is that if an investor wishes to undertake a new project, there are risks associated with it and costs of capital. Somebody needs to finance the project associated with it. So the higher the hurdle rate, basically the higher the perceived risks and the higher the costs of capital on that project. So it's quite a remarkable gap, 24% and 5%. And actually a study by Oxford Institute for Energy did a similar study for new coal assets, and there the hurdle rate was 40%.
Thank you, Jana. Maciej, would you like to add your take on this topic? And I have one more additional question about the hydrogen. You talked a little about the hydrogen. Do you agree that hydrogen could, fill last year's like a poor cuisine of other sources? I mean, the attention of politics, of public.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of angles here, I think, but two that come up to my mind now in the context of what we're discussing here today, and especially investment arbitration, I think, is specifically, well, two items. One of them is about expectations. And the specific example of hydrogen, these expectations are now being fueled day by day. There's no single day they go to the web. If you're in the hydrogen industry, there's no announcement of yet another big investment or yet another big policy in this country or that country in the EU, or the EU itself setting up, the bar higher and basically incentivizing entities to take money out of the pocket and invest. Now, this whole thing is a big gamble because the green hydrogen today is not only more expensive than other fossil fuels or renewables, it's more expensive than other types of hydrogen at this stage. So the costs have to go significantly down. Whether this is going to be the case, we'll see. But what happens if, let's say, there is this regulatory framework that will continue on, and there are these corridors I mentioned, and that we are approaching 2030, and then 2040 by when the EU expects to produce 10 million tons of hydrogen, green hydrogen domestically and import another million from abroad. What if this does not happen? And all these investors, they put money on the table, and these end up being what Jana said, are stranded assets. And then just another thought, because what I just said is basically an open question. So I'm not going to answer left or right, or if it's going to be just to play a tiny role or a big role in the engineering. The expectations are huge. The Germans are betting big on that, and that's actually the greatest hope in the whole playground, that the German policy that aims to actually replace natural gas by hydrogen in the heavy industries, that this will lift the industry further across the continent, including in the sea. But if this is going to materialize indeed, we'll see. Another question, I think, and I'll stop at that, but very briefly, which is yet another even more issue. Is, let's say the risks that are difficult to quantify, but they're nonetheless crucial. And some of them have not even been in the spotlight 10 years ago. And I think especially here about the protection, physical protection of assets. For instance, Poland is now going bigger renewables, and we are planning to, I'm actually planning to, we're more from planning to executing, to building our first big wind farms in the Baltic. 10 years ago, if you were to ask anyone in the wind industry, it would be concerned primarily about, capex, investments, of the numbers, and so on and so forth. Today, the primary concern, broadly speaking, is whether there's not going to be in a year or two from now, like this, another green little man, a diver, they'll just plant a bomb or something, and the whole thing will go off. Who's to blame then? The government? The investor? Both? How to split the blame? And this is just, given what is happening now in Europe, with all these hard warfare being waged against EU countries in all sorts of manners. We only see the headlines, but there's so much going on. I think it really sheds a big light on investment arbitration in the region for years to come. That's I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Bartosz.
Thank you. Can I offer, just for the sake of rebuttal, a little bit bleaker view on all this green transition to low carbon energy? And I think I wanted to make 2 points. One is, and that's both to what Jana said and what Maciej said. So I just happened on the way to the office this morning, I listened to this podcast by Ezra Klein, who's New York Times journalist, and he's, if you ever have time, these are long podcasts, but quite interesting. So today he talked about why in the 70s in US the production really stopped, the effectiveness and what was back then thought that will be a great future, and nuclear energy will be everywhere, and we will move into the world like from sci-fi. So he was giving this example of a movie which was culturally totally alien to me from the 60s of sci-fi series, where in 2024 the life would be totally different than now. And his proposition was that for reasons which are difficult to fathom, the fact that, and that's to Jana's point, the fact that we need, there seems to be a need something. So now we say there will be a need for energy because artificial intelligence will need a lot of energy. Artificial intelligence needs a lot of energy, apparently. My son runs a startup and he tells me it's only US can really afford that amount of energy that will be needed. But the logic behind this thinking that because something will be needed, that will happen, I think history teaches us that that's not necessarily the case. Second point is about hydrogen. And I mean, you said right, it's a campaign. I just wanted to quote what I read in Financial Times 2 days ago about hydrogen. So the title of this article was "How the Hydrogen Hype Fizzled Out," and I quote, "Once viewed as a super fuel that could decarbonize large chunks of the economy, the likely uses are shrinking dramatically. Costs have been revised up, in some cases as much as double. Subsidies have not yet delivered anything. There is also rising uncertainty over how useful actually it will turn out to be." So just wanted to make this point. There is this other alternative that will not necessarily transfer into the big arbitration cases that we're all thinking about, at least not during our, at least my life, professional lifetime.
Thank you, guys. I think that now we can start the last topic, which may be a good sum up of our discussion in this panel too. I would like to start with Mark and next Bartosz, and we will talk about the rise of energy disputes and arbitration. Cases related to energy disputes likely constitute the largest number of cases registered by ICC and ICSAD. Martin talked a little about it before. Guys, can you expect to see greater numbers of these disputes in the coming years in Central and Eastern Europe, and why? Would geopolitical factors also play a crucial role?
Actually, I'm going to defer to Bartosz to lead on this in light of the fact that it goes directly into the remarks he just made. So I certainly have opinions on it, but I'm going to hold myself.
Okay, so I will be brief. I've got, I think, 2 or 3 propositions that I wanted to make on that point. And that's basically about energy transition in the region, how that might impact the arbitration cases. My first propositions relate to what Martin was talking about a little bit, and that's also a little bit of rebuttal. My proposition is that we do not have a robust and sufficient legal structure to attract sufficient investment that will be coming given the geopolitical risks in the region. And Martin, you said rightly, there's you observe, or you put it to us, there is decreasing the willingness to invest in the region because of it. I think we agree. I mean, in my practice, in transactional practice, which I sometimes cross the aisle and go to my transactional colleague, we can certainly see that there is now a premium put on the risk because of the war that's thousands miles or kilometers from us, but still the perception that viewed from Earthwell is that we are just bordering the war. So there is this premium. Now, but then you rightly also say that there's a declining use of ISDS. There are new BITs that I think if you ask investors, they might say they are not necessarily, when it comes to the risk mechanism, robust enough. So my question is, where is the system that would put protection, legal system that would incentivize this vast amount of money that are needed to come here? There might be an answer to that might be what actually Mark, I think, is proposing, that will all become contractual rather than investor state and that system. Well, I'll get to that as well. My second proposition, to which I alluded in my previous intervention, is that transition actually to this whole green transition will be slower than we think, and will be more probably centered around nuclear and traditional renewables, wind and solar. But Europe, and I think Central Europe as well, just leaving aside this uncertainty side under my first propositions, is likely to see quite a lot of transition-related projects. And I'll just give you 2, evidence or examples. One is now already dated times like by Queen Mary review, this report from 2022, so quite dated now, says interesting thing about that as well. So they say the majority of respondents know that the impact of the energy transition was unlikely to lead the dispute until towards the end of the decade. They also say that Russian invasion of Ukraine is likely to set back the time frame for the energy transition. So that's the point Matthew was making: security first and transition second. So I think that is also the evidence that it will be slower. But almost 3/4 of respondents, 73%, choose Europe as a region most likely to see an acceleration in energy disputes. So that I thought was interesting. And my third proposition, to which I also alluded earlier, is that I think the jury is out whether investment arbitration will play a significant part in this, or whether that will be predominantly contractually based arbitrations. I mean, we will all know the reasons for that, in particular in Europe. I mean, ECT, dare I say, it's defunct now. I mean, there are reforms that are, I understand, languishing, and we don't know where it will go. But the number of withdrawals, so I stopped counting, but I mean, you will know better, but it's significant. And then obviously intra-European investments, well, we know how it looks. So that will be my proposition. I think investment arbitration, subject to some major reforms, might play lesser role than we think.
Bartosz, I don't disagree with anything that you said. But I have a war story. Calvin, I'm going to ask you a question. We did not prepare this, so I apologize in advance. But your mention of the 1970s and nuclear power is what triggered this story in my mind.
I shouldn't have said that. Background.
You know, sometimes you lose. I was a transactional lawyer for many years before I retired and moved to the dark side in arbitration. In the 1990s, I received a telephone call from a client who said, Mark, will you represent us in bidding on a wind power project in Africa? I said, well, of course. I hung up and I thought, I have never done a wind power project. I know nothing about wind power, but I've got a partner in California who I think did a lot of them back when wind power was really popular in the 60s and 70s in California. And I picked up the phone, I called and I said, help. And he helped me for several weeks. He sent me thousands of pages of documents that he expected me to read. And he lectured me on the phone and I asked silly questions. And after those weeks, and I began to have some understanding of wind power, I said to him, there were dozens of wind power projects in California. What happened to them? He said, oh, they all went bankrupt. California withdrew its subsidies and they all went bankrupt. What do you think about the reliability of subsidies for the elements of the energy transition? And you mentioned them in the context of hydrogen. You can mention them in the context of nuclear power. There are a whole host of different areas in which the transition depends upon subsidies. What you're thinking about that, Bartosz?
Very tricky question, Mark, and I should make a disclosure that Marcin and I have a little dispute where this topic features prominently. So as long as it is on the basis of Chatham House rules, I can say that I'm not sure the question whether subsidies are important or not for me. This is for people who know. So in terms of nuclear energy, I couldn't say anything. What, right? That depends, economists and so on. But what I would say is from the investor's perspective, and also I think from the state's perspective, what's important is predictability. Right? It's that you set the framework and you stick to that. And if state doesn't want to stick to that, and that's another topic we probably don't have time to open. But again, Marcin alluded to that, for example, because policy changes, because of environmentalism, that's fine as well. But you have to pay damages.
Maybe I would like Marcin.
No, I just wanted to add.
Because Bartosz, was looking at you and said your name twice, so maybe you would like to share your opinion.
I just wanted to add 2 words to what just Bartosz said. He said that you need to pay damages. I wanted to add or not. State this, 2 words make a difference. So that's but I do agree with you, Bartosz, that I wanted to raise this point that a stable, predictable legal environment in particular is what matters the most for the investors. And if you go into economic transition, as Poland used to be in the 90s, that was quite difficult to achieve this predictable, stable environment that Poland decided to conclude VATs with certain legal guarantees, and then decided to start the process of joining the EU in order to make this stable and predictable legal regime. And that's what matters, of course. And in the presence, there are of course certain options. One of them is contractual, but in certain cases, contractual option does not simply do not exist. Take, for example, the mining process or any licensing process. There is no contract with the state. There can be any contract with the state. So the general legal rules is what matters, and any regular changes in the while the process is being pursued by the investor, of course, simply can trigger a case, right? So can institute a case. That's my point for the time.
Jana, would you like to add?
No, I think it's a very interesting point that Mark raised, because indeed subsidizing means using taxpayers' money, and we know that from long-term perspective, it's not sustainable. But I think there might be, and I would be interested in Mate's view on this point. There might be a light at the end of the tunnel, at least for solar. I know wind is still kind of problematic there. In terms of solar, I think we have moved forward in terms of technology. There are sort of batteries that hopefully should be able to store the energy produced, which could be a sort of the solution for renewable energy going forward. But I think, Mate, you might have a view on that one.
Sure, thank you. Well, a couple of points because this has really turned out to be a very dynamic and rich discussion. But one thought that has been sort of haunting me for the last couple of minutes is the following, because you were pondering subsidies and its role or the lack thereof times in the green energy transition and how it had allowed other fuels to prosper at large scale. Well, I think one way to look at it is that for fossil fuels, which we should not forget have been subsidized since day one, and they continue to devour billions and billions and billions of dollars every year in various countries, simply for you, the people, to be satisfied, meaning for the energy to flow into the grid. Now, subsidies for fossil fuels are sort of a premium for that supply to happen in the first place. For the green energy, at least that's, I think, how the thinking goes in a bunch of places, not only in Brussels, but perhaps above all in China, is that green energy is subsidized for the premium. I mean, or it is the premium for the holy grail that is energy independence. Because for a country, for instance, like China, I know it's far from CE, but just let's zoom out a little bit for a second. They not only want to produce, at the end of the day, in a couple of decades from now, enough energy from wind and solar to satisfy themselves, but also, or if not above all, for that energy then to inundate other markets in the region, because this gives them a direct geopolitical leverage. Now, in Europe, on the other hand, the thinking is that we need that green energy to become independent, for instance, from Russia, let's say. But, like we mentioned earlier, there are other vulnerabilities, such as supply chains, because we need critical minerals for all those windmills, turbines, all those things, EVs, to happen in the first place. So how about that? So we have now this critical minerals directive. We have like a whole bunch of regulations that either have already been put together or are being penned as we speak in Brussels. But now that's all fine. And basically, there will not be a full-blown energy transition where we're halfway or fully achieved, depending on what happens. Because I agree with Bartosz that there are a lot of holes poked in this entire picture, and I'm not sure if Yogi would be able to predict what the future holds for energy security and the transition in the long run. But the trajectory is there, clearly. And there's a clear business timeline, I think, at this stage in Europe, broadly speaking, that this is the way to go. But what if the geopolitics really overshadowed the whole game? And for instance, all these critical minerals that the EU wants to produce, like part of them, like 10% out of all the demand that we have in here in several decades from now, and all the rest will be imported from Africa and elsewhere. What if these supply chains are severed? Simply, there's no minerals for the transition to materialize. What then? Is there plan B? Like, if you talk to a client, for instance, that has like this expectation he'll just milk that cow of a wind farm or something for decades, but not be able to sustain it because there will be no parts to service them, the infrastructure, because there simply will be no enough minerals in years to come. What about that? Like, it's a big question mark, and I think one that undermines the viability of the energy transition in the longest of runs. Yeah, and kind of just one more comment about the ECT, because I actually had the doubted privilege of representing this lovely country in the negotiations on the monetization of ECT. And if we are indeed on the Chatham House rules, what I can add to the conversation from my side is that at the very end of the tunnel, the bottom line conclusion is that the ECT is done for Europe, but not least because the Japanese are very happy with the ECT as it is. They want to keep it for themselves. They are very happy about the protections it continues to give to their investors across the globe, because they have so many more big corporations that are active in the fossil fuel industries. While in Europe, it has become more of a liability because, I mean, of course, the narrative is that, and there was good ground to do away with DCT because of the compatibility with the EU law. But above all, governments were concerned about all these massive lawsuits and the billions that have to be paid to investors, right? So the irony is that a treaty that was established to protect the rights of investors in the fossil fuels industry in the 90s has turned out to be the most important instrument in the renewables disputes in Europe. So hence the irony, hence the ends of the ECT. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys for the fascinating and rich discussion. And my last question to you, each of you, and maybe 2 minutes, starting with Marcin. What important new trend regarding the disputes in energy sector we'll be talking about at next year's conference? Maybe you can add something about AI impact on energy sector. Could AI speed up the process of decarbonization, or maybe rather grow up the amount of disputes?
Well, thank you. Well, that's a tough question, I would say. Well, the first thing that comes to my first thought that comes to my mind is that it's a climate change and the regulatory measures that would be taken by the states. Switch or changing the legal regime, decarbonization as always, and plus certain issues regarding the renewables in general. But that's my first thought. The second would be that the cases in which states switches or start to pursue another type of energy policy, and that affects state manifold areas from starting from commodities to mining. So that's my 2 points as I think.
I agree with what you have said. I think what we didn't touch upon a lot today is actually issues in the supply chain, and I think this will continue. Basically, 2 large markets disappeared, and they impact on iron production. So my tip would be that we will continue cases stemming from basically from the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you. We should probably, the thing I'm going to talk about is probably something we should be talking now, but it's just not enough time, so maybe next year. And it's about Ukraine. And on the point is that once the war is over, the question is how Ukraine will be rebuilt and whether energy infrastructure will be rebuilt with green transition money. So it will be already rebuilt, greenfield, green. And I think that's a quite fascinating future, hopefully.
Since I've already said that the disputes of the next 5 years depend on the transactions of the last 5 years, or more broadly on the activity of the last 5 years, it should come as no surprise to you, Patricia, that my thoughts about next year's disputes come from what's happened in the recent past, not what will happen in the future. And what has happened in the recent past is an enormous disruption in supply chains, as Anna said, driven to a considerable extent here in Europe by, as Bartosz said, Russia and Ukrainian war, but also significant rethinking of relations with China as a supply source. In the last year, we've seen a considerable effort to alter those supply chains. And of course, people are advantaged and disadvantaged by those alterations, and they will likely seek legal remedies if they are disadvantaged. Some of them may be investor state, but far more of them are likely to be commercial. That's my 2 minutes.
To pick up what you just said about these disputes coming out from transactions made in the 5 years before, I think this can be extended to a 15-year framework, whereas there are 5 years during which the trends are being set up and discussed, and then there are transactions, and then there are disputes. And very briefly, two things that are particularly haunting my mind in terms of what's coming, possibly. Some thoughts that came up during my time at COP27 last year that I was lucky to attend, and all these conversations we had as our Portugal Banks BGK's team with all the stakeholders there. The two words that are coming up most often in the conversations with all sorts of stakeholders, but not wind, nuclear, or solar, or something else, was carbon offsetting and CCS, or CCUS, if you like. So basically, carbon offsetting, very briefly, it's a sort of mechanism that sits somewhere at the intersection of climate finance, engineering, and accounting, that basically, for those hard-to-abate industries that cannot really offset their emissions, they can do so by buying a forest in Africa or doing something else. And there's a lot of gimmicks in that, and already there have been accusations of greenwashing, and actually these are real deals that will be likely leading to real disputes. And then for CCS, for carbon capture and storage, the EU has already admitted formally that the green transition will never succeed unless we also go big for carbon capture and storage. Well, the EU directive on that has laid out the regulatory framework dates back to 2009. Not much has happened, but actual projects are now in the pipeline, including one big carbon sequestration port receiving that it is going to be built in Poland alone. A lot of, let's say, angles to that part of the conversation, but broadly speaking, the carbon market is booming, but it may as well fizzle out at some point if it does not really yield the results people hope it will. So in the meantime, in terms of the expectations, the gap between expectations and reality may be, I think, lead to disputes in the next couple of years.
Thank you. This is probably the right moment to bring our discussion to an end on time and on target without any budget. Marcin, Diana, Bartosz, Mark, and Maciej, it was a pleasure to be speaking with you today about this very interesting topic. And the audience, thank you for your participation and attendance. And I think that you would agree with me that our panelists deserve applause for their valuable contributions. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Very briefly.
David, you want to raise comment?
Wonderful. I'm one of the co-founders of World Arbitration Update. My name is Jose Antonio Rivas. Yes.
Just give us 1 second. I think we might have a few questions from the audience before we
Okay, go ahead. Sorry for that. Sorry for interjecting. Please go ahead with the questions.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for an interesting presentation. Maciej, I had one question for you, and I know you offered this point under Chatham House rules, so maybe it's not entirely fair, and that's fine if you want to talk about it afterwards. But you mentioned that the withdrawals from the ECT, I believe what you said was, were driven in substantial part by European states being on the receiving end of claims, and that was the principal motivation. So do you not see that there was a concern or perception among constituencies driving the change to come out of the ECT as an idea that would somehow support green energy transition, even if it is not in reality, as you seem to suggest?
I think perhaps Marcin would be the adversary of the question at the end of the day, but to sort of my experience and points with regard to that topic, I think they boil down to one fundamental sort of psychological assumption, which is that post-Acmea, there has been this thinking, I think now well entrenched, that the EU is enough to defend the rights of investors in the energy landscape in Europe, and that's to the extent that ECT has been a tool for mutual use, let's say, because after all, every treaty has, this the double edge, right? It says both the private sector and the public sector. In this case, I think the sway has removed to in a direction so as to convince these policy makers across the scope, because it started in Poland, but it went all the way to the West. Now basically all countries having convinced the EU that it's better, we'll be better off collectively if we leave the ECT altogether rather than keep performing it, at least because of the pressure from other ECT members to keep the ECT as it is. So that was one fundamental hurdle to actually introduce enough climate protections in the treaty so that it would be satisfactory for all the member states. And since that was not really achievable, it turned out to be that, okay, there's been these liabilities, all these problems, well, maybe let's drop the ball, and there will be other layers of protection that are already in place that guarantee the same kind of rights. I'm not to judge if that's indeed really the case. I think it depends on the case, and the circumstances, but that is the prevailing thinking, and I think that thinking has led to the withdrawal from this.
Antonia, I think we're ready for you.
Okay, so seems that we're ready. Excellent. Well, thank you very much to everyone. As I was introducing myself, my name is Jose Antonio Rivas, and I am one of the co-founders of World Arbitration Update. I practice international commercial arbitration and investment arbitration here in Washington, D.C., and I teach at Georgetown the same subject, investment arbitration and public international law. We're thrilled to have this panel. We're really thrilled to have a panel of experts, not only in arbitration, but also your views on geopolitics, and also the experiences that the Eastern Europe region is going through, and because of the war, the conflicts, but also the transition in energy. And I can only say thank you for making a panel that involves a difficult subject possible, and thank you for being there. That's all I wanted to say, and I also wanted to say thank you to Jadranka, who has been a force behind establishing for the first time the World Arbitration Update in Poland, and hopefully we'll have other editions in the future. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and have a good drink for everyone here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. And I'll add just a brief, couple of brief notes to that. I do want to extend my heartfelt thanks to each one of you for your participation and engagement, your presence, whether here with us in Warsaw or virtually, has made this 4th edition of the World Arbitration Update truly special as we explored the dynamics of the growing international arbitration market of Central and Eastern Europe. I believe you will agree with me when I say that all our discussions today, starting with the effective cross-examination of expert witnesses to the managing of specialized international arbitration practice, and finally to the fascinating topic of the effects of global trends and geopolitics to the energy disputes in the region, have been insightful and enriching. And it's really through sharing these insights and through collaborative efforts like this that we continue to advance the field of international arbitration. So thank you very much for that. I do want to once again thank our host, PwC, especially Sirshar Qureshi and Paulina Komorowska, who helped set up this event. And of course, to our sponsors, without which all of this wouldn't be possible. I now invite you to join us at TWF, where we actually partnered to support the event on due process in international arbitration, after which we will co-host the reception and raise a toast and continue networking with a wonderful arbitration community that gathered in Warsaw this week. So with that, thank you, and until next year.
Thank you.